It's still just about morning, so good morning everyone, and it'll be afternoon soon by the time I've finished. Hopefully it won't be good evening by the time I've finished. Thank you to Sport Singapore and to the National Youth Sport Institute for the invitation. My wife and son are delighted with the pictures I'm sending back to them with me standing in shorts in the sun. They've been very happy with those. It's a real pleasure for me to come across and to hopefully share some ideas with you, which hopefully will be of use in both looking at coaching, but also perhaps looking at the way in which we develop coaches as well. It's very much my pleasure to be here. So thank you for the invite. I should also just, before I keep going, just thank Joanne for being my chaperone. It's been great for you to show me around and drive me here, there, and everywhere. So thanks for that, Joanne. We have this sort of random title of capturing dynamic quality youth coaching in a framework, a fool's errand, or a hot pursuit. So broadly speaking, the work we're currently doing for Sport Singapore is to look at this idea of a competency framework. And this is some work that we've been involved with through the university, but also as part of the YCC. Now, it's as part of today, I think we're probably going to look more about what is coaching, what might that mean for frameworks, and perhaps as we progress on through the week, we'll look more at a framework. But the reason why I've talked about a fool's errand or a hot pursuit is very much because frameworks have existed for forever in all sorts of different occupations. And sometimes those frameworks have been useful, and sometimes those frameworks have been less useful, and sometimes those frameworks have just been ignored because they don't necessarily match the reality of what the framework was meant to be helping with. So they have been a fool's errand, but I think also we get them right, they can be this idea of the hot pursuit. It's something which can be really useful. So before progressing on, I thought it might be useful for you to just know where it is I come from. So I'm at Leeds Beckett University. As was mentioned, I'm the head of subject there for sport coaching. So Leeds is pretty much slap bang in the middle of the UK, but is classed as being in the north of England. So we have Leeds here. What we have here is where the two best football teams in England are. So we have Liverpool and then Liverpool under 23s. Not Everton, obviously. And then in between we have this strange city which also has two teams in it, but yeah, they're not that good. So within Leeds, we have Leeds Beckett University has two campuses. They have a city centre campus, and then just to the north is the Headingley campus, which is probably a bit greener, and that's where the sport faculty is situated. And then if you want to see that, so this is the Headingley campus. So as you can see, it's a very green campus. We've just been recently opened a brand new building. So when Google decided to fly their drone over us, it wasn't quite completed. But it now looks like this. So having been at Leeds Beckett for 14 years, I don't know what we've done without having this building for 14 years, other than have very nice buildings. Buildings look very nice from the outside, but on the inside are a bit dilapidated. So it's been brilliant that we've had this new build. This is an 80-meter indoor running track, which if you are interested in doing a long jump, you can open the doors at the end and you just keep going and probably break a world record and break several other things as well. So that's where I'm from. So what am I going to talk about today? Well, there's a whole range of things which I think we can talk about when we look at this idea of competence frameworks, if they're going to be meaningful. So there's a few things I'd like us to get into, which is what is coaching, this idea of theories espoused versus theory in use. So I'm going to do this versus what I actually do. And we perhaps look at why looking at that from that perspective might be very helpful for us in terms of understanding the challenges of coaching and coach development. Spend a bit of time. This is the National Youth Sport Institute, so we'll perhaps spend some time looking at youth sport coaching. And then because competence frameworks are often talking about, well, what are they like at this level versus this level or this level, I think it would just useful to spend a little bit of time looking at what changes as coaches get better. And we might even want to question what we mean by better. And then a final little look at what that might mean for building some competent frameworks. So, what is coaching? Now, this is always a question I ask my undergraduate and postgraduate students at the beginning of every time I start teaching them. And often what we get back when we ask the question, what is coaching, is actually people talk about what the outcome of coaching is rather than what the process of coaching is. And actually, what is it we're trying to help people get better at? It's the process of coaching on the basis, as people have actually been saying, it's been brilliant to sit and listen to experienced coaches talk about their process and talk about if we get the process right, the outcome will come along. Well, that's just as true for coach development as well. We have to look at the process of what coaching is in order to help people become better at coaching. So if we look at coaching from what the literature talks about, so the literature talks about coaching fundamentally as a pedagogical process. It's a learning and teaching process. But beyond that, it's also a social process. It's fundamentally embedded within a social setting. And it's filtered and developed around relationships. But it's also a political and strategic process. Because it's within a social setting, and that social setting will have policies, and those policies will be, some will be written, some will be unwritten, some will only become apparent to you when you've broken them, even though you didn't know the policy actually existed in the first place, but once you've broken it, you find out. And there's often competing goals, and competing goals is often what makes something political. So why do we have different political parties? It's because they have different views on how things should be. And that's just as true for coaching as it is for politics in general. So if we look at the research that's been done around coaching and coaching process, it generally falls within a pedagogical, a social, or a political strategic process. And it might be one, two, or all three of those things. And I think very much what Jessica started out with, and certainly listening to the coaches, if you listen, they actually talked about a pedagogical, a social, and a political process. Felipe, you were talking about what do you do, what would you recommend? Well, talk to your bosses. Well, talking to your bosses is not really pedagogical, it's probably social, political, and strategic. So these are the things, these are the challenges that face coaches. And then where that leads us to is to recognize that therefore the endeavor is fundamentally a personal one. It's lived in the first person. Often when we talk about coaching, we talk about coaching as if we see it on a TV screen. So I see a coach and I see some athletes and therefore coaching is going on. And I talk about that as being a third person view about what coaching is. But if coaching is a lived experience, it is a personal process. So I think it's useful for us, and often far more useful for us, to think about it as a first-person activity, to the extent that a coach doing their job is always doing coaching. And that has some really big implications, I think. So, for example, if that's a group of coaches, they are coaching. It might not be what we immediately think of what springs to mind when we say, what does coaching look like? But if those people are coaches, having a lived experience, a job as a coach, so therefore they are coaching. This is probably what we might consider to be more like coaching, as in we see a coach with an athlete, and there is a delivery of coaching going on. But equally, there might be some sort of post-competition debrief. So this is the Scottish swimming coaching team. And this was when they were out at a competition. And so we might also think about coaching being about seeing a coach at a competition. So that's coaching. So coaching is either delivering or being at competition. But actually, all of these things involve coaches doing their job, and therefore they are coaching. Now, one of the questions that I often ask coaches is, how many of those things do you think you get paid for? And typically, it comes back to that and that. Yeah, again, coming back to what you were saying, Felipe, is that how long does it take to actually create a session? It takes about 2 to 3 hours. Now, I once had to basically tell off my own university for advertising a job, which was classed as a half-time rowing coach, which was 18 hours of delivery. So I wrote them a little message saying, 18 hours of delivery is a full-time job. Well, no, that's what they have to do. It's 18 hours of delivery. And my question back to them was, well, how do they prepare for that 18 hours of delivery, and where do they start to reflect on that? Because they won't actually be very good at delivery if they can't plan and they can't learn and they can't reflect. So actually what you'll end up with is an exhausted coach who isn't very good and is quite poor. So we perhaps looking at coaching being a lived experience, then a coach doing their job is coaching. And we have to recognize that all of these things are coaches doing their job. They are always coaching. Talking to the media, talking to parents, being involved in professional development are all coaching. I think I've laboured that point long enough now. So let's just perhaps expand our view about what coaching is. And then we might want to think about, well, over what time frames does that occur? Is it a session? Is it a season? Is it multiple seasons? So again, we perhaps move from this idea of coaching being about a delivery of a session. So I coach an under-15s rugby team. I'm a voluntary coach. I probably invest maybe somewhere in the region of about 8 hours a week, maybe a bit more sometimes. But of those 8 hours, probably 3 of those are either delivery or in competition. The other 5 is me constantly replying to WhatsApp messages saying, what time does training start? And trying not to annoy my parents by going back. We've already said that about 5 times, but anyway. But actually, when you get into it, I'm talking to the other coaches and saying, what do we think we need to do? Where do we think we're going over the next few weeks? And this is voluntary coaching. It's a community sport. It's not someone who's employed full-time to take a group of players on a journey which might last 3 or 4 years. Having said that, I'm now in my 10th year with this team, and it gets easier every year. No, it doesn't. So what is coaching? I think coaching is all those things. So we continue down this line of saying, well, coaching is a first-person activity. What does it mean to be a first-person activity? So one of the things that we've been talking about for quite some time now within the group that I work with is we start talking about coaching being a judgment and decision-making process. And if we take that, the first start of any judgment decision-making process is perception. What are we seeing? What are we hearing? And I think this is a really interesting place to start, because often we miss it. And we also miss the fact that perception starts a judgment process. And that judgment process will then influence a decision. And that decision will lead to a behavior. And that behavior has a consequence. Now, what typically has happened within coaching is when we look at coach education, what is coach education often being interested in is that bit. What's the behavior, what's the consequence? Because now I can give you some feedback. So I once, I don't know whether this is a good story to tell or not, but I once failed my rugby coaching award because there were a group of athletes who were stood not doing anything whilst I was being assessed. And when he told me that, I'm going, yes, I know, that was deliberate. Well, they can't be stood doing nothing. They weren't doing nothing. They'd been asked to observe what was going on with the other group of players who were playing the sport. Yeah, but they can't be stood around because our governance says that actually all players should always be engaged. Yes, but they were engaged. No, they weren't. No, they were. They were being asked to do something. They were being given a task. But essentially what had happened was the coach had observed my behaviours and looked at the consequence of those behaviours. This is the coach educator, and in his opinion, had decided that were people that weren't engaged, because that was one of the things he had to tick on his list, that players always had to be engaged. So what he hadn't done is spoken to me about what was I seeing and what were my judgments, what were my decisions which were leading to my behaviours and consequence. And actually, those were ongoing. It's not just like that happens once. So once a consequence has occurred, I now need to respond to that consequence. And what do I do with that consequence? And so coaching becomes a series of ongoing judgments and decisions that I have to respond to based on my perception. And actually, some of the most skillful things we will do will be this. So I've heard quite a lot this idea of looking for teaching moments. And if we look at the literature around judgment decision-making, that's known as seeking leverage points. Seeking leverage points is actually a higher order cognitive skill. Being able to see a teaching moment is actually a really high level skill, and it doesn't happen quickly. That, I mean, if you've worked with novice coaches, you'll know that they miss loads and loads of things. And because they miss it because they don't know to look for it. So part of the skill that we start to develop is knowing where to look and what to look for. And once we see that, what does that actually mean? So there's another phrase in the literature around expertise is seeing second order cues or hearing second order cues. So as I speak to, when I use my coaching quite a lot to try and support the undergraduates I teach, and if I don't see a player turn up for 3 or 4 weeks, and I know that because the parent has actually said, little Alex, well, Alex won't be there this week, Alex won't be here this week, Alex won't be here this week, and I go, well, that's 3 weeks in a row where the parents has actually told us Alex won't be there. And that starts to ring a bell in my head, which is saying there's something not right here. So that actually happened recently, and I sent the parent a message. Now, this is a parent I've known for a while. This Alex was played for a couple of years and fell out of it because he was clearly not enjoying it. Then he came back and was doing very, very well, and suddenly he's disappearing again. And then his mum, because presumably I at some point built up some trust with this parent, then starts telling me that he's having a real problem in school. His dyslexia is really starting to kick in terms of his confidence in school. I'm going, I didn't actually know he was dyslexic. There's something noted. And I start to learn something about that player that I didn't know previously, but I wouldn't have known if I didn't have the capacity to actually go back to the beginning, which is this parent's now said 3 times in a row that this player can't come to training. So these are really important set of skills that we need, and if we don't have them, we can't actually do a lot of our job as coaches or well, even coach educators. Everyone has to go through this judgment decision-making process. Now, actually what starts to happen is if we get good at that, we start to create ourselves as having some level of professional competence. So this is something that was written actually looking at professional competence in medicine. The habitual and judicious use of communication, knowledge, technical skills, reasoning, emotions, values, and reflection in daily practice for the benefit of the individual and community being served. And I'm going to go, well, there's coaching. But when it's described like that, you look and go, it's quite a difficult thing, this. It's a high-skilled role, and I'm going to come back to the idea of high-skilled roles a little bit later on. So that's what we might want to start thinking about when we're creating a competence framework, is it's about professional competences. What are the things that make people good at this? And recognizing the complexity of what people are doing. But equally, that says a lot about what is it that we're trying to support coaches getting better at if we're going to use these frameworks to influence our coach education. And fundamentally, to me, it's about improving their judgment and decision-making, but we might want to think about a little bit more about how that works. So conveniently, some research that exists around judgment and decision-making. So if we look at the common view of coaching delivery, so we might talk about coaching being about planning and reviewing and delivering. And I've deliberately split these up because they align quite nicely with the decision modes that Yates and Shearhart talk about. And they suggest that there are 3 broad ways in which we can engage in decision-making and judgment. The first is very analytic. The second is beliefs, and the third is automatic or intuitive decisions. Now, generally speaking, what they would talk about is that we're more likely to engage in automatic or intuitive decisions when we don't have a lot of time. And where do coaches not have a lot of time? When they're in a delivery mode. We're more likely to engage in analytic thinking when we have some time. Where do we have more time? Typically, it's in planning and reviewing opportunities. But the interesting thing for me is that they talked about this idea of they actually talk about rules, but I'm going to talk about beliefs, and I'll perhaps get into that a little bit more later on. But we have these rules which guide the way in which we enter into a problem. And really conveniently, by having a group of coaches on before me, they all start to identify what some of their rules were. So for example, going back to Jessica talked about teachable moments. That is a rule, that is a belief. There's a belief that teachable moments exist. What else did I have here? So mix players to maintain morale. Trust the process. What else did we have? I'm sure there was some more. Let me just go back. Oh, build relationships. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. These are beliefs and rules which guide the way in which we engage in our practice. And actually, it's almost certainly a lot of what we do when we think a bit is we engage with this. Now, we might engage with beliefs to come up with a quicker solution, or we might engage with beliefs to give ourselves a way into a more analytic way of thinking. It's a way into a problem. But part of the problem is that we know that a lot of these beliefs or rules are often implicit or semi-implicit, as in we don't know we have them until someone starts to point them out to us. So I often sit and listen to going, what are the rules which guide their practice? And I did this with a group of Irish coaches a few weeks ago, and I gave them the task to listen out for it. They then didn't do the task, but never mind, but then they were busy doing other things. So I just went round and listened to them engaging as coach developers and listened for the rules that they were using. And I presented back to them 15 rules that I'd heard in around about, probably engaging for 5 minutes with each group. And they hadn't realized that any of them had realized that any of those 15 rules were being used. But they were being used because they'd already verbalized them. Now, if we don't know we're using them, then they're often what become as known as beliefs without reason. Now, they might have a reason if I'd stopped them saying, oh, why is that a rule? And then you might be able to verbalize why they're using it, so we're able to engage in analytic thinking. But if I don't know I use them and I don't know why I use them, it's very difficult to use them to get into analytic thinking. So it's very difficult to reflect on something that we don't know we use, even though we use it. So hopefully that's landing. So this idea that we have these beliefs and they guide a lot of our practice, and the more we're aware of them, the more able we become to actually control them and learn from them. Now, the other thing I've added in here is that what's the sort of theory that's used? And now, Yates and Shihart don't actually use this term. They use different terms, but I think these are better terms, so I'm going to use them. So there's an idea of there being academic theory or folk theory. Academic theory being what we might learn from reading papers, listening to coaches who have thoroughly unpacked why they do what they do. So not all theory has to appear in a paper or in a book. People can have very, very good theories which is very well unpacked and thought through, and that to me becomes more academic theory. Folk theory tends to be more rules of thumb, passed down, do it like this, don't ask me why, but just do it like this. And what we know is that a lot of academic theory is grown from folk theory. So it's not to suggest that folk theory is a bad thing and academic theory is a good thing. That's a false dichotomy. But it's more about recognizing that perhaps academic theory, and again, reinforcing it, not all academic theory comes from academics, it's more robust, it's been critiqued a lot more, and people have tested it. But if we know that people deliver with reason or without reason, how does that reflect the way in which we look at coaching? So just before I move on, I just thought it might be useful for you. So these are some of the rules that I use in my own delivery. So for example, and the one I've not put up there is the one which is most important to me is create meaning. If I can't create meaning, then ultimately a lot of things are relatively pointless. So why do I listen to what you people, the coach has been talking about? It's because that's what's meaningful. So in which case it makes sense for me to reference that back. But in terms of rugby, so I use the rugby principles: go forward, support, include opportunities for catch, pass, kicking, tackling, competing, restarts. I'm really interested in the role of perceptual skills in terms of what players are seeing and hearing. I want to create challenge. I try to amplify the things I want them to notice. I'm really interested in making sure that everyone's included and everyone gets the opportunity to include. So there's always that one player who drifts off to the wing, and they might touch the ball twice in about 5 or 10 minutes, and you're going, right, come off the wing, you're going to go into the centre. These are the positions in rugby because you'll touch the ball more here. So I'm trying to make sure that everyone's getting some level of opportunity, and I'm really interested in promoting opportunity. Now, those are explicit rules that I have, and I could talk to you about why I have those rules. So they are beliefs with reason. But what we know is that that doesn't always happen. And one of the ways I think about this is by thinking about what does the world feel like? If we're in an intuitive moment, I'd probably do some stuff and I might think about it. And that's what it feels like when you're in that delivery mode. But we then have this other world which is telling us theory and practice is really important. It's really important you know your theory to your practice because there's theory-practice gaps. By the way, there isn't a theory-practice gap. There is a gap between theory and thinking. It's artificial to say the gap is between theory and practice because that's something that the person who's doing that work, unless it's beliefs, everything that we do is without reason, there is always some level of theory behind why we're doing what we're doing. So if there is a gap, the gap isn't between theory and practice. The gap is between theory and thinking. So hopefully these things start to align. But if we see this bit, the planning bit is about being how I want to see the world if I'm planning, if we think planning is important. And again, if we don't pay people to plan, then do people really think planning is important? By the way, obviously think planning is important, so we should recognize it in the way in which we pay people and reward people. But if those things don't connect, then there is a disconnect. We end up with beliefs without reason. So we want these two worlds to speak together so that they actually feel one part of the same world. So does our theory espoused, this is what I'm planning to do, fit with what I think fit with what I actually do? And how well do I really know what I do? So the next clip I'm going to show you is David Beckham talking about football. No, he didn't do a very good job. But this is someone who's got probably, by the time he's done this, 30 years of football and football at the highest level, and he's struggling to explain what football is. So if he has that struggle, then how could he actually engage in a planning process, which is perhaps about taking a player on a 5, 6, 7, or 8 year journey? So even some of our most expert people now, I'm pretty certain that if David Beckham was taken on a coach development journey to help him unpack his experiences as a player, he would probably get it pretty quickly. You don't become that good without having some good learning behaviors. So it's not a criticism of David Beckham, it's a recognition that sometimes we have beliefs that we've never really thought through. And that means it's difficult for our planning behavior to influence our delivery behavior. Now, this is a coach who my colleague Bob Muir was working with in a mentoring situation. And, well, let me just play it, and I'll perhaps talk through in a second what this was getting into.
Long, pick your shots, pick your shots. What was that jab? Boys, clean up inside, clean up inside, clean up inside.
Okay, what we have in there is 5 interactions in 15 seconds, and the coach is in the ring with them. And we might look at that and go, okay. But Bob presented this back to the coach. And this is what the coach said back to Bob. It's not air, is it, Bob? And what's air? Air is that one of the beliefs that they had was that they want adaptable, independent, resilient, robust boxers. And his response was, if I want that, why am I talking all the time? So in other words, his delivery behavior was not reflecting his planned behavior. So his theory espoused did not match his theory in use. So again, coming back to what you were saying, Felipe, about get yourself videoed. Does what you say you're going to do actually match what you do? Now, just to reinforce, this coach was the first British recipient of European Coach of the Year. And actually, one of the things this demonstrates as much as anything is why this person is a good coach. Is because they're willing to be videoed and challenged on why they're doing what they're doing. And the fact is that he picked it up without Bob even having to say anything. So again, this is not a criticism of a coach. In fact, it's the opposite. It's actually saying this is the reason why this guy's good. The willingness to open up and challenge yourself about why we do what we do. So how can we influence theories espoused to actually be theories that are in use? Well, one of the things that we're really keen on within the work that we do at Leeds Beckett is for academia to be more about reflecting the world rather than the world having to reflect academia. So how can we capture what's going on? So we've been doing a lot of work over a number of years trying to work out how do coaches do their job. Now, obviously, part of our job is to try and tidy that up because we're getting information from lots of different people. But one of the ways in which we've done that is to present it as this, the coach decision-making model. Now, the first basis of this is to say that coaching occurs within a culture of policies, pathways, resources, NGBs, expectations, constraints, resources. There's all sorts of stuff that goes on around the coach which will influence what they're able to do. But within that, what we've identified is, broadly speaking, there are three things that coaches think about. Who is it they're coaching? So how well do they understand the athlete? What are they coaching? And going back to what David Beckham was talking about, how well did he really understand what he is coaching? Because if you don't understand what you're coaching, it's very difficult to actually give people good questions, a good practice. I mean, Rick's here, who does a lot of work around constraints coaching. It's very difficult to create a constraint if you don't know what you want that constraint to do. So, and they also think about, how do I coach? Now, when we get into this, we get, well, what's the theories around understanding an athlete? So we would talk about biopsychosocial, the biological, psychological, social growth and maturation of an athlete. So we might get into the sports sciences here, but no, we don't talk explicitly about the sports sciences. Equally, when we want to understand the sports, well, we look at sport as being a technical, tactical challenge which will draw on people's capacity to be fit and both mentally and physically. Then again, we could see that within this, there's the application of the sciences here, but the starting point is the sport, not the biomechanics, or the sport and not the decision making. It's what is the sport demanding? And equally, the how is, how are we teaching? And this is where we might get into the research around skill acquisition and pedagogy. And then we might look at how those things connect with each other, so the who and the what, that perhaps provides us the basis for this idea of the athlete-centered curriculum. The who and the how is, how do I create good, meaningful relationships with the people I'm coaching? The what and the how do I develop a task or a practice? How do I decide I'm going to communicate with the athlete during that moment in order to facilitate learning? Now, like I say, all of this is derived from our conversations with coaches and the research that we've done with coaching. With coaches. And then the final one which overlays all of this is, if I don't have if it comes up, there we go, a sense of who I am, what are my beliefs, what are my rules, what are my values? If I don't know what they are, then typically they will override what I think I'm going to do anyway. So broadly speaking, if we never actually engage coaches in trying to ask, well, you know, we ask these sorts of questions about what is your philosophy, what do you believe? How do you think this works? Are you sure that what you say you're doing is actually what you are doing? And we can perhaps talk about, well, what are the ethical challenges that you face? So all of these things, and what would you do with those ethical challenges? So going back to the questions that I thought were great questions that Jessica posed, because none of those questions had a straightforward answer. To the extent you could actually justify probably 3 or 4 different answers to those questions, and I'm going to come back to that later on. So, and the way we answer difficult questions like that is by knowing who we are and what our beliefs are. So the next thing that we've worked out in terms of when we look at good coaches and what good coaches do, we see this, the emergence of what we've classed as nested thinking, or this idea of thinking deliberately. What do I deliberately want to do? Because one of the things that we see a lot with coaching is deliberateness doesn't always follow through. We get caught up in just the flow of how things operate. Now, when we see this done at a long-term level, we will see that coaches think deeply about the strategic and political goals that are facing them. And that those political and strategic goals then start to influence what I might do over a year. So I might think about this over a 3-year process. And I then go, well, what are we trying to do in that first year? Okay, if that's the first year, how does that then flow into how I break down that year? And then if I've got that breakdown of the year, and I'm going to break that year into, let's say, 3 lots of 12 weeks, what does that first lot of 12 weeks look like? And what does that then mean in terms of the first week, second week, third week, fourth week, and so on? So what this means is whatever I do in, let's say, week 5, when I'm in that delivery mode, that is nested back into what I think my beliefs and philosophies are about what I'm trying to achieve as a coach. So hopefully the thoughtful process, or let me add this in, the analytic thinking should, if it works, start to influence the intuitive thinking. So what I deliver should reflect what I've been thinking about, if I've gone through that thinking process of how do I actually do this. Another model that we've created is looking at, well, what does this actually look like if we just look at a single session? So this is something my colleague Bob Muir's worked on, the coaching, practice, planning, and reflective framework. And the idea would be is that if we take one of these sessions, that session might have a learning objective. Now, we want players to engage with that learning objective in order to facilitate their learning. So how do I do that? Well, I set up a learning activity, and I engage in coach behaviors. And those coach behaviors might be about problem setting, or they might be about problem solving. So problem setting might be, I'm going to ask you questions, or I'm not going to actually say very much to you at all. Problem solving might be, okay, I'm going to give you some feedback. I'm going to give you some hints about how you might want to do this differently. But that's me solving the problem, not you. So I actually eventually want to come back to more around problem setting. Or we could have game-centered approaches, or we could have something which might be more technically focused. But whichever of these things are, they are designed to deliberately facilitate me achieving the objectives for that session. And what we refer to this as being constructive alignment. Is my learning activity aligned with my coach behaviors, aligned with my player engagement, aligned with my learning objectives, aligned with what I'm trying to achieve in that session and over a number of sessions? Now, if I do that, I start to achieve an alignment which is constructive for the person I'm trying to work with. But it now also gives me a framework against which I can start to reflect. Okay, did you achieve your learning objectives? I'm not sure. Well, okay, and we get this quite a lot with relatively novice coaches is, well, they were really struggling with it. Okay, but you've said from the outset that you want to problem set in quite a complex situation. Did you not expect that they might struggle with it? So in fact, the player engagement you were predicting would be that the player would struggle. And because they struggled, what you actually started to do is you started to intervene because you didn't like it, because you thought they weren't learning very much. So your gut reaction was to step in when people struggle, whereas in fact, one of the things you're saying is, I want them to struggle. So we start to look for this as being both a planning and a reflective process for sessions. Now, when we place all that together, we have a nested planning process which influences my sessions, which is developed through me thinking about the who, the what, the how within the culture and context within which I'm operating. So these are the things that we see people doing. Now you'd look at that and go, that's actually a pretty complex process. That's not something that someone who's a novice coach is going to engage with. That's probably towards the end of, but if that's towards the end, well, where would we start with novice coaches? And actually, I would probably suggest that you start with what do they believe and how does that influence the session? If I can influence that from this point, then I might be able to start moving people on. So just going to quickly talk through about, well, what about the context of youth coaching? Now, helpfully, Jessica's already talked a lot about the context of youth coaching, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. But one of the things that, there was a piece of work done by UK Sports a couple of years ago where they were interested in what's the difference between pathway coaching and coaching Olympic athletes. And they were particularly focused on what is it that we need to understand about pathway coaching. And they came up with 3 areas which strangely aligned with the pedagogical, with the social political. So an individual athlete pedagogical point of view is there's a broader range of biopsychosocial challenges and goals that face young people. They're doing lots of things. They're at school, they're doing exams, they're trying to be in sport, they're also trying to have friends, they're starting to emerge as an adolescent, they want ownership but they don't want responsibility. There's just a lot of stuff going on. But with so many significant others that influence what goes on with the young athlete, it's actually very difficult for a coach to claim attribution for why someone's getting better. I doubt there's a coach in the room who's worked with a young athlete who's not looked at an athlete gone, where did you learn to do that? I haven't taught you that. And actually being able to let go and think, well, I didn't have to teach you that, but it becomes hard because there's so many things going on in a young person's life. It's quite hard to claim attribution, whereas if you're working with an elite athlete and their sole focus is working on that, then it's probably a bit easier to look for attribution of, this is me influencing the way that person works. Now that has a lot of implications for the way in which we want to try and measure impact. How do you measure impact of a coach working with young people when there's so many other things going on? And I would say that takes you back to, well, if you can't claim absolute attribution, we can perhaps start talking about, well, why did you do what you did? And we can peer review that. Well, did you think about this? Oh, you did think about that. Oh, that's quite interesting. So you did something else instead. Why did you do that? So we can peer review the process and be less worried about the outcome. And then we also have a social political level, which is, within the UK at least, that because youth coaching is, and my guess is not that different from Singapore, youth coaching is often seen as a stepping stone into better senior work because I get paid better at senior work than I do at youth work. You go, well, that's a strange situation to have, isn't it? That actually youth coaching is seen as a stepping stone rather than being actually, it's a vocation I want to engage with and actually earn a living from. So again, we might start to look at, well, what's the reward framework for coaches working in the youth sector? And why do coaches think that? It's because there's often less resource, time, financial facilities. So, how do we help coaches cope with that social political level of development? I was just going to very briefly look at this model as well, because it's not one that's perhaps being shared today. So this was some work by Bailey and Collins, who looked at, well, what changes as young people grow, and how does that affect their motivation? Because we looked at motivational climate, or someone was mentioning motivational climate earlier on. They talked about 3 broad motivations that exist: participation for personal well-being, personally referenced excellence, and elite referenced excellence. And actually, you could have a group of young people and have all 3 of those motivations in that group. That there are some people who turn up just because it's part of, I just like playing rugby, Andy. I just like playing rugby. Can I just play? Versus, Andy, I really want to get better at my passing because I think it needs to be better. Why do you want to do that? Well, just because I want to be better at it. I want to be better at passing. Right, okay. To the next person who is, how do I get into the talent process, Andy? I want to be a professional rugby player. I need to stand out from everyone else. So as a youth coach, you might have all 3 of those motivations in front of you. How do you create a motivational climate that reflects all 3 of those people? I remember when I taught this to a woman who was the head coach of the university football team, and she was quite frustrated because she had a Premiership player in her team, but she got frustrated with it because she wasn't doing everything she thought she should do. Until she saw this and went, actually, she's just a good player. She just wants to play football. She plays football from a point of view PPW. I've just assumed because she's so good, she should be about excellence, but that's not what her motivation is. So why do I keep putting all this pressure on her? Because actually, the more I do that, the more likely she's just going to leave anyway. So recognizing why people might be stood in front of us, and I thought this was a really nice way of looking at it from, in terms of how we might want to consider. And the other thing that Bailey and Collins talked about is these change. And as I get better at something, that increase in competence might cause me to think about, I actually want to do more of this. So I might shift from a PPW into an ERE or even to a PRE or an ERE. So it's not meant to be a fixed sort of line that you're in. These things can change, and as we retire, we have different reasons for playing football, or I still play football. My legs hurt all the time, but anyway, that's a different matter. So I thought that might be a quite useful thing to look at. There's also the talent development environment work from Henriksen, and people have already talked about this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but that none of this exists in the vacuum. all of this exists within a social cultural setting. So how does that social cultural setting affect? So Jessica was talking about, well, why is it that we get more people through the system from medium to small towns in Canada? And would that replicate to other countries? And again, I was really pleased that she talked about that, just because it happens in Canada doesn't mean that's going to happen everywhere else. But what doesn't change is that the social cultural setting will impact on what happens within any sort of talent development environment. And this was quite interesting because I've not shared much of this survey response with you, but this was one of the things I thought was useful. So this was responses only from people who said that they work with youth, and 1/3 of those people, 1/3 of those coaches from Singapore said, parents are not part of my coaching. Now, I don't offer that as a criticism. I just offer that as a reflection that that's perhaps where people are, 1/3 of the people are thinking. And I think it's a useful reflection point for us to get into. Because I know there is this sense of, and I know you, Kevin, I know you were joking when you talked about keep your friends close and your enemies closer, but quite often people have pushed, I'm aware, within, especially within football, within the academy. Oh, has that just gone off? So anyway, within academy football, sorry, is that one? Oh, that was, I've got it, that's great, thank you. That parents were kept at arm's length. Yeah, parents are a crucial part of any talent development system. It makes sense to draw them into it and educate them. Again, Jessica has already talked about effective coaching. So she'd already presented this one. Now, this is some work that we did with Olympic coaches, but a lot of those Olympic coaches were also pathway coaches. So they talked about the consistent achievement of highly challenging goals, but through an ethical, integrated system and interpersonal problem-solving approach. So these seem to be the things which make coaches effective. So again, what we're seeing essentially is a pedagogical, social, and political process. And I'm wary of time. So I'm just going to talk briefly then about what changes as we get better, because this might help us start to think about how we might want to map this. So what do we know, looking at the literature, about what changes? Well, basically, the longer that coaches stay in the system and the better they get, the tasks seem to become more about longer time frames. The pedagogical challenge moves from a good session to creating a program. Dependent on relationships, that really, really matters. So social literacy is crucial. And we engage more and more with political and strategic goals, even within community coaching. So I and my co-coach are very, and luckily because we've worked with the parents so long, again, we have a belief that at this age, we're not a talent club, we are just a community rugby club. And our view is that players should get equal opportunities to play the game. It's just a belief that we have. So we've never really had a sense of what's our best team, and let's put that out, and then we'll just filter players in. Now, luckily within the UK, actually, rugby have created a rule. It's the half-game rule. It doesn't always get followed, but the rule is that if you have players on the touchline, they must play half a game. So it's not this idea of people coming on for the last 10 minutes. But it does become more political and strategic. There are more players, and it's not just the people who we coach are the players, there's players in the system who we have to negotiate and align with. But what also happens is we generally become more accountable. And as things grow, we get increased uncertainty. And what do we do about that uncertainty? So these are the things which change. The coaching challenges essentially just become bigger. Now, what also happens, we typically see people become more thoughtful. So coming back to beliefs, so Kahane talked about a triple loop learning approach. Single loop learning is based on simple beliefs. Well, why are you doing what you're doing? Well, we have beliefs around winning, enjoyment, keeping them busy, keeping them active. And the question might be, am I doing things right? When you get into double loop, we might be engaged with more complex beliefs about, I like to be athlete-centered, I want to be theory-based. And the question might become, am I doing the right things? And at the triple loop, it perhaps starts to be much more connected with our deep beliefs about how we think the world should be. Recognizing beliefs can compete. So we've heard that is this about development or is this about winning? Can I have both of those things? Are these in conflict? I've got this person telling me I need to do that thing, that person telling me I need to do that thing. So there becomes a lot more internal and external conflict. And you start to ask questions around, how do I decide what is right? So we move from, am I doing the right things? Sorry, am I doing things right? To, am I doing the right things? To, how do I decide what is right? So I'll just give you a quick worked example of this. So, for example, and this is, it's not a real example, but it's something we might consider. So from an academy selection. So the action might be, we should pick the best young players, let's send out the scouts. And then we experience surprise. So we reflect most when we're surprised, and the surprise might be there's often a lack of consistency in what scouts are selecting. Well, we can just continue doing what we've always done, or we can think about it differently. So in which case, let's train the scouts to improve consistency. And then what we find is, even when that's been done, the research suggests that scouts typically pick the relatively older children, the bigger, faster, stronger players, who are always, not always, sorry, are typically the players born earlier in the cycle. So we can continue doing the same thing, or we can start to think differently about, well, are we doing the right things? We might not be doing the right things, so let's do something that's different. Let's broaden the dates we select over and broaden the criteria. And then we see research which suggests that talent emerges at different times, and the best systems are not overly concerned with performance and keep as many as possible for as long as possible. So do we keep doing the same thing, or do we actually just really start to question everything that we think about? So we go from not doing things right to we're not doing the right things to we're not doing the right things, and have we even really thought through what is right? What do we think is the right way to do a talent pathway? So we start to get into some quite deep beliefs about how we think we should do these things. So again, that's what we see change. We see that level of introspection change as coaches get better. So I like this. This is work from Biggs and Collis. I'm wary of time here. So Biggs and Collis talk about what changes as people get better with judgments. They talk about going from a unistructural idea, which is, so we might have a problem, we have a belief about how we solve that problem, and that leads to a solution. And that belief might be, aha, your technique needs to be better. And then someone might say, well, it's not just technique, it might be about some of the fundamental movement skills, but it tends to be quite unistructural in its process. What then starts to build is the idea that there might be other structures that we might need to consider. So we might need to think about the biopsychosocial being, we might need to think about tactics, we might also need to think about the practice design, the behavior and the objectives that we're setting. So that's multi-structural. And then we might also start to think about, actually we need to consider how all of those things interact with each other. So it becomes relational. And then as it becomes relational, we start to recognize that these are quite what is known as wicked problems. In that you whack one mole and another mole pops up. So the problem's almost without a solution. So you have to do the best you can do. And because you have to do the best you can do, what you start to recognize is there might be more than one solution. And sometimes you've just got to do something, but which solution do you pick? Well, through a judgment process, you have to pick one, or more, maybe one or two. But when you pick those one or two, you pick them in recognition what the other options are. So that actually, either one of those solutions isn't working the way you thought, you've now got a reflection point to go back to think about, well, perhaps we should try this one instead. So the extended abstract view is that you start to see the world as a world of wicked problems, and actually part of this world is you've got to work out how you do things. So this presentation has taken me hours and hours and hours and hours to put together because there's so much I could talk about. So I've still got another slide deck with about 10,000 other slides in it, which you'll be pretty pleased to know they're not going to be appearing on here now. We could be here all for the next couple of months. But it doesn't mean that if a question comes up, I've not got that in the background to go, I can draw on that to perhaps answer a question. So again, these seem to be the things which, it's the end stages of when people become really good, is to recognize that there are other options, but I've chosen this option for a reason. And if you ask me to defend it, I can defend it And if you ask me what would I do differently if things change, I can tell you that quite easily as well. So just to conclude then, what does this mean for building competence framework? Well, if we go back to the beginning, we're looking at how do we help people that have this habitual judicious use of communication, etc. Coaches do this in contexts of one or more of pedagogical, social, and political. But then who's the coach? So we've used this analogy in the past about the cook or the chef. So this is 7 years ago where this is Fred Abraham, the mess maker, versus Claire Smith, the Michelin star chef. Now in coaching, we will call both of those people coaches. So who is the coach that we want to be thinking about, and what do we call, so we might go, well actually that's the coach. This is someone who's dabbling in coaching. But that's not very inclusive. And we get caught up in this really quite complex argument about who is a coach and who isn't a coach. But if we want a framework we want to professionalize, we might actually at some point need to decide, how do we demark some of these things? So is there community coaching and is there professional coaching? Is there voluntary coaching and is there professional coaching? And what's the difference between those things? And what's the needs of this person versus the needs of that person? So as I say, I class myself as a voluntary coach. And as I say to my students, I'm not a very good coach. They sort of go, well, how can you teach coaching? It's because I'm a good coach educator. I've got thousands of years, might be thousands of years, might feel like it to you at the moment. I've got thousands of hours of doing coach development. I've probably got about 1,000 hours of doing coaching. So of course I'm going to be better at doing coach development than I am at coaching. I've had more practice at it. So we might want to think about, well, what is it, how do we demark this so that we allow those professional coaches to have a sense of going, yes, I am a professional coach, and probably the world needs to recognize that, and if I'm getting on my high horse, the world needs to reward that. So these are tough questions, and because they're tough questions, they're wicked problems, and there's not an easy answer to the question. Which then means that, well, we start to look at what we might want to consider. So this project's been really interesting for me because before I started the project, I didn't know that an international standard classification of occupations actually existed, but it does. And they talk about 4 skill levels, with managers being the skill level 3 and 4, professionals, so medics, lawyers, the old school professions would be classed as a 4, technicians and associate professionals are classes of 3. Now, what they would say within this, that the term high-skilled aligns with skill levels 3 and 4. And when you look at the international occupational list, coaching is classed as a 3. So coaching makes us a high-skilled role, and you're thinking, thank goodness for that. But then you go, but which coach? Is it? Presumably it's this coach, and actually you'd probably say that this woman's probably also a manager, so in fact she's probably skill level 4. But this person is not skill level 3. Yet they're still classed as a coach, by common decree. So this is where it does get complex. But one of the things we might use as a demarcation is deciding at what point does someone become highly skilled. And that is often aligned with levels of qualification. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of saying qualifications, because when I talk about this, you'll say, people go, Andy, it seems to me as a university lecturer, you seem to be saying everyone needs to go to university. That seems like a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy to me. That wouldn't be my view. My view would be is that there are lots of ways of becoming highly skilled. University is one of them, but it's not the only one. There are different ways of doing this. You can become, well, the work we've done with the FA, we've had a number of people come onto a postgraduate diploma with us who did not have a degree, but they definitely had postgraduate thinking. Why? Because they've been doing the job a long time and they've thought deeply about why they did what they did. They perhaps just haven't had someone give a structure to all of that, and that's generally speaking the response we get from people is, this has been really helpful for me, Andy, because it's just clarified why I do some things. But it, generally speaking, hasn't changed the world for them. So this is a set of competencies that we created for the international degree standards. I actually looked through this and thinking about some of my best students who are on our undergraduate degree, I think it's quite ambitious. I think probably a degree student who's gone out and worked for a couple of years might be getting most of those competencies. I don't think by the time they've left after a degree they have got all those competencies. But it's based on identifying what are the jobs that people are doing, what are the functions that people have to engage with. How do we reflect those jobs in terms of what people do well into the competencies? And then we acknowledge, well, what does that mean for the knowledge that people require? So here we see those 6, what I was saying before is, so there's the how, there's the who, there's the what, and then the understand self, understand the context and culture, and understand process and practice. So to conclude then, if there is a framework to be developed, and there is, we want that framework to reflect the complexity, if we're looking at the framework for the top level, but also reflect what that might mean for the community. But equally, we need to perhaps look at, does the system reflect what we think are the challenges that coaches face? So we've been asked to look at a coaching framework. We've not been asked to look at the whole way in which Singapore coaching works. But the feedback would be is that this framework needs to be part of a system, so the rest of the system should be considered as part, and I'm sure it is being. I'm not teaching people this, okay, so hopefully I'm not stepping over the line here in terms of things I'm saying, but it's part of the overall system. If the system facilitates all this, a competence framework can be about the hot pursuit. If it doesn't, it potentially becomes a fool's errand. And apologies for going over, but hopefully that's been of interest. Thank you very much for listening.
Hey, thanks, Dr. Andrew. So I'm just going to dive into these questions, if we may. So how can NSAs actually, NSAs as in National Sporting Associations, how can they support and encourage for these coaches to get to improve their professional competency, or what can they do to support it?
So could you just repeat the question for me again? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. It's for national sporting associations, like organizations, like, for example, Rugby Association, let's say. How can they provide a more supportive role in promoting this effective quality coaching for youth, especially?
Yeah, I tend to start big picture with this. If we want coaches who are capable of engaging in constructive alignment, then the coach development process also needs to be constructively aligned, which starts of being, what do we want coaches to be like? How do we know we've got that? And what we then need to put in place in order for that to work. So now that might be formal courses, but it might also be about facilitating coaches in their workplace. So for example, the Football Association in the UK, because they've got a lot of money, let's face it, and that money is being supported by the Premier League. They go out and support coaches in the professional football clubs. They have an FA coach developer assigned to them who can just go and support coaches in the workplace without even being linked to a coaching award. But equally, they will have coaches in that club on the coaching award, so they can support on the coaching award at the same time. So ultimately, I think it's a mix of being very clear about what we'd like coaches to be like, and then looking at the learning processes that we've got in place to support coaches achieving those goals. And I think the final part is recognizing if coaches change, the development process needs to change as well. So there are three broad ways in which we look at education: pedagogical, andragogical, and hortagogical. So pedagogical tends to be more about being directive in our learning. Andragogical tends to be more about being facilitating reflection and looking at the role of how things connect with each other. And then hortagogical is just supporting people on their journey. From an education point of view, from a higher education point of view, it's like the difference between the way in which you would work with someone on a degree versus a master's degree versus a PhD. So as people change, the way in which we support should also change as well.
Thank you. Okay. I think we have time for one more question. All right, we don't. Oh, that's a shame.
I talked too much.
All right. Now
that was definitely the shepherd's crook coming out. Yeah.
All right, but thank you so much. I think he's done a really good job in the presentations, and thank you for going through the effective youth coaching.
Thank you.
I'll hand this back to Chevelle.